In the turbulent 1980s, as Mexico's drug routes fractured under rival hands, one man envisioned order in the chaos. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, forged alliances among warring traffickers, uniting them under a single banner, a federation that would transform Mexico's drug trade forever and redefine criminal power. In the heart of Mexico's Sinaloa state during the 1970s, when dusty roads carried more secrets than cars and lawmen often looked the other way, a new kind of power was quietly emerging. It didn't roar with violence at first. It whispered through influence, money, and loyalty. That power was a man, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Before the world knew his name, before he became El Padrino, he was a former federal police officer with sharp instincts and a vision that reached far beyond the rugged hills of Sinaloa. Gallardo was born in 1946 in Culiacan, a city already touched by the scent of the marijuana trade. Farmers across the Sierra Madre Occidental had learned that the plants growing in their fields could earn more than any legal crop. For years, small-time smugglers moved shipments north, bribing local officers and sneaking past border patrols. It was profitable, but it was also fragmented. Dozens of groups fighting over routes, territory, and power. Each region had its own boss, its own rules. What Mexico lacked was unity, and unity was exactly what Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo intended to create. By the mid-1970s, Gallardo's life took a sharp turn. Working as a bodyguard for Leopoldo Sánchez Celis, the governor of Sinaloa, he gained access to Mexico's inner political circles. He learned how deals were made in whispers and envelopes, not in blood. He understood that true power didn't always carry a gun. Sometimes it carried a handshake. Through these connections, Gallardo began to build a network that extended from local law enforcement to high-ranking government officials. Corruption wasn't new in Mexico, but Gallardo refined it into an art form. At the same time, drug production was evolving. The United States, trapped in the rising tide of cocaine addiction, was shifting its focus from marijuana to white powder. The Colombian cartels, particularly the Medellin cartel led by Pablo Escobar and the Oco brothers, were flooding America with cocaine. But their biggest challenge wasn't production. It was transportation. The Caribbean routes had become dangerous, watched by U.S. radar and patrols. They needed a new path. And Gallardo, with his growing connections and strategic mind, saw an opportunity that could make Mexico indispensable to the global drug trade. To achieve this, Gallardo began forming alliances with other key traffickers in Mexico. There was Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known as Don Nito, an older smuggler with deep ties in Guadalajara and years of experience moving marijuana. Then there was Rafael Caro Quintero, a young, ambitious trafficker from Sinaloa with a ruthless streak and a fortune built from massive marijuana plantations hidden deep in the Mexican desert. Together, these three men formed the foundation of what would become the Guadalajara Cartel, the first true drug federation in Mexico's history. Their partnership was built on logic and profit, not ego. Gallardo provided the structure and political cover. Fonseca brought wisdom and trust among older smugglers. Caro Quintero supplied manpower and fearlessness. Each controlled their territory, but they operated under one vision: cooperation instead of chaos. Gallardo called it La Plaza system, dividing Mexico into territories, each managed by trusted lieutenants who paid a share of profits in exchange for protection and access. For the first time, Mexico's traffickers weren't enemies. They were partners in a nationwide enterprise. By the early 1980s, Guadalajara had transformed into the nerve center of the Mexican drug world. Mansions with tall iron gates lined the streets, guarded by men carrying automatic rifles. Hidden behind these walls, deals were made that stretched from Colombia's jungles to Los Angeles nightclubs. Airstrips carved into remote ranches became busy runways, their planes packed with Colombian cocaine bound for the United States. The Guadalajara Cartel became the bridge between South America's suppliers and North America's consumers, and at the center of it all stood Félix Gallardo, calm, calculating, and untouchable. Gallardo's genius wasn't in violence, but in organization. He treated the drug trade like a corporation. Each division had its role. Transport handled the shipments, logistics managed the routes. Finance laundered the money through banks and shell companies, and intelligence kept watch on police movements and rival groups. He even had a department for security, ensuring that anyone who betrayed the cartel disappeared quietly, often without a trace. It was efficiency born out of criminal necessity. The United States had the DEA. Colombia had the Medellin cartel. Mexico now had its own empire, but with success came attention. In 1984, the DEA began noticing massive surges in cocaine moving through Mexico. At the same time, rumors reached their offices about a colossal marijuana plantation hidden somewhere in the Mexican desert, a place so large it seemed impossible to exist unnoticed. They were hearing about L.B. Falo, a sprawling 500-acre plantation in Chihuahua run by Caro Quintero. The fields stretched as far as the eye could see, watered by an elaborate irrigation system, protected by hundreds of armed guards, and managed like an industrial operation. The profits were staggering, nearly $8 billion annually. It was proof that the Guadalajara cartel had become more powerful than anyone imagined. The discovery of L.B. Filo marked a turning point. When Mexican authorities, pressured by the United States, raided the plantation in November 1984, they destroyed thousands of tons of marijuana. The loss was catastrophic for the cartel, and for the first time, Gallardo's carefully balanced empire felt the pressure. Anger spread among the ranks, suspicion turned inward, and paranoia grew. Who had leaked the location? How had such a massive operation been discovered? For Gallardo, it was a warning that their growing power could no longer remain invisible. At the same time, DEA agents working in Mexico began to close in on the cartel's network. Among them was Enrique, Kiki, Camarena, a determined and fearless agent assigned to the Guadalajara office. Camarena had spent years building informants, uncovering shipments, and documenting the cartel's movements. His work began to disrupt operations, and his name started circulating among cartel leaders. In Gallardo's world, exposure was a threat that had to be eliminated. As tensions rose, the Guadalajara cartel still continued to expand. Gallardo strengthened his ties with Colombian cartels, offering Mexico's territory as the safest passageway to the U.S. border. In exchange, the Mexicans received a percentage of every shipment, a system that brought endless profits. The Colombian connection also introduced more sophistication. Money was funneled through international banks, often laundered in Panama or the Cayman Islands, cash from U.S. Drug sales was flown back in private jets, hidden in cargo shipments, or smuggled through the border disguised as legitimate trade. Gallardo's influence reached deep into politics, police forces, and even the Mexican intelligence community. By 1985, the Guadalajara cartel controlled nearly every major drug route into the United States. From Tijuana to Matamoros, every crossing was managed by one of Gallardo's lieutenants. The organization was so well structured that even U.S. agencies struggled to map its full hierarchy. They knew the name Félix Gallardo, but catching him seemed impossible. He moved quietly, avoided publicity, and left no trace of his wealth. While others flaunted their riches, Gallardo preferred to remain unseen, the man behind the curtain. But the balance was about to shatter. In February 1985, Kiki Camarena disappeared outside the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara. His abduction was swift, professional, and terrifyingly precise. He was taken to a house owned by one of the cartel's members, where he was brutally interrogated for days. When his body was discovered a month later, wrapped in plastic and buried in a shallow grave, the world took notice. The murder of a U.S. federal agent on Mexican soil sent shockwaves through both nations. The DEA launched Operation Leyenda, one of the largest investigations in its history, and the United States demanded justice. Under immense pressure, the Mexican government began arresting those linked to the case. Rafael Caro Quintero was captured in Costa Rica later that year. Don Nito was arrested soon after. The once invincible Guadalajara Cartel was unraveling. But Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo remained free. He had foreseen the storm and quietly retreated to his home in Guadalajara, continuing to pull strings from behind the scenes. Even as his partners fell, his influence persisted, protected by layers of corruption and silence. For Gallardo, the arrests were both a setback and an opportunity. The era of the Guadalajara Cartel was ending, but a new structure could rise from its ashes, one even more resilient and decentralized. He began reaching out to regional bosses across Mexico, from the Arellano Félix brothers in Tijuana to Amado Carrillo Fuentes in Juarez, and the Carrillo family in Sonora. He proposed a federation, a coalition of cartels, each controlling its own territory, but united by shared interests. There would be no single ruler, no central headquarters. Each plaza would operate independently, but cooperate on transportation, pricing, and distribution. It was a plan to preserve stability and prevent war, and Gallardo was the architect. By the late 1980s, Gallardo's vision had become reality. Mexico was now divided into zones, each governed by powerful families and loyal commanders. The Tijuana Cartel, the Juarez Cartel, and the Gulf Cartel all owed their origins to this reorganization. It was the birth of a new era in the Mexican drug trade, one that would dominate the coming decades and plunge the nation into cycles of conflict, corruption, and bloodshed. But for a brief moment, under Gallardo's careful guidance, there was unity, a fragile balance held together by fear and profit. Behind closed doors, Gallardo still maintained connections with politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement. His mansion in Guadalajara became a meeting place for power brokers, both legal and illegal. He continued to live modestly compared to other traffickers, often dressed simply, his demeanor calm and disciplined. Yet beneath that calm lay the mind of a strategist, one who understood that survival depended not on violence, but on control. The rise of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was not just the story of one man's ambition, it was the story of how Mexico's drug trade evolved from scattered smugglers into a unified empire. It was the blueprint for every cartel that came after. But even as his influence reached its peak, the walls were closing in. The DEA's hunt intensified. Former allies turned to protect themselves. And within Mexico's own institutions, whispers began to spread that El Padrino was no longer untouchable. The world was changing. The Colombian cartels were collapsing under U.S. pressure. New players in Mexico were rising, eager to claim power. And soon, the man who built an empire from the shadows would find himself facing the same fate as those he once commanded. In the humid air of Sinaloa, where the mountains meet the desert, and the smell of the earth mixes with the faint scent of marijuana fields. A young man was learning how power really worked in Mexico. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was not born into wealth or corruption, but into a country where influence could be bought, loyalty could be traded, and silence was often worth more than gold. It was the 1940s, and Culiacan was already a breeding ground for a new kind of enterprise. The illegal trade of drugs moving north into the United States. The demand was growing, and the men who dared to meet it were learning how to turn backwater villages into empires. Gallardo grew up quiet and observant, the kind of man who watched before he acted. He joined the federal judicial police, where he learned how the system worked from the inside, who to pay, who to fear, and how to make problems disappear. In the 1970s, Mexico was already exporting marijuana and opium, mostly run by small local groups from the states of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua. Each operated independently, guarded their routes fiercely, and trusted no one outside their circle. Violence was frequent, but it was contained. There was no single authority, no structure connecting them. That disorganization kept them small, and it kept Mexico from being more than a middleman in the growing drug economy. While serving as a bodyguard for Leopoldo Cisneros Celis, the governor of Sinaloa, Gallardo began moving within the orbit of the political elite. It was here he understood that power did not belong to the one holding the gun, but to the one who could influence those who did. He gained a reputation for discipline and intelligence. When he eventually left the police, he took with him a network of contacts that stretched deep into politics, law enforcement, and business, the very connections that would later shield him when the stakes grew higher. By the late 1970s, the drug trade in Mexico was beginning to shift. Colombian cocaine producers, led by men like Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers, were facing intense U.S. pressure. Their Caribbean routes were being dismantled by radar and naval patrols. They needed a new corridor, one less visible, one that could guarantee shipments safely into the United States. Mexico's vast border, corruption, and geography made it the perfect alternative. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo saw this before anyone else. He understood that if he could unify Mexico's smugglers, control the routes, and negotiate directly with the Colombians, he could turn the country into the new center of global trafficking. To make that happen, he needed partners who could bring power, experience, and loyalty. He turned to two men from his home state, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known as Don Nito, a seasoned smuggler respected among older traffickers, and Rafael Caro Quintero, a younger, impulsive trafficker already making millions from marijuana cultivation. Together, the three men formed the foundation of what became the Guadalajara Cartel. Its base was the city of Guadalajara, a modern hub with strong infrastructure, discreet luxury, and the perfect distance from the U.S. border to operate undisturbed. The Guadalajara Cartel was unlike anything Mexico had seen before. It was not a gang, it was an organization. Gallardo structured it like a business, assigning departments for logistics, transport, finance, intelligence, and security. Each region, or plaza, had its leader who paid a portion of profits to the central organization in exchange for access to routes and protection. Through bribery, the cartel infiltrated police forces, customs agencies, and political offices. With each deal and each envelope passed, the system grew stronger. In exchange for cooperation, the government received a share of the wealth, and the traffickers received silence. Caro Quintero expanded production on an unprecedented scale. In the desert of Chihuahua, he developed a hidden agricultural empire known as Rancho El Bitufalo. The plantation stretched across thousands of acres, irrigated by a complex system of pumps and canals, guarded by hundreds of men armed with military weapons. Workers toiled in the sun, harvesting marijuana that would later be dried, packed, and shipped north. It was one of the largest drug farms in the world, generating billions in profit every year. From their base in Guadalajara, Gallardo and his partners negotiated with the Medellin cartel, establishing Mexico as the new transit point for Colombian cocaine. The arrangement was simple. The Colombians would supply the product, and the Mexicans would move it into the United States. In exchange for using their routes, Gallardo's organization received a percentage of every shipment. The system was efficient, profitable, and nearly invisible. For a brief time, Mexico became the indispensable link in the world's most lucrative illegal trade. Gallardo was known for his composure. He avoided unnecessary violence, preferring negotiation and influence. His goal was control, not chaos. He kept relationships with politicians, police commanders, and businessmen, ensuring that his name was whispered in respect but rarely written down. Guadalajara's elite mingled with traffickers at private gatherings where business and politics blurred together. Money flowed through banks, real estate, and front companies. The cartel became a parallel power, one that existed within the shadows of the state itself. In 1984, the illusion of invisibility began to crumble. Information reached the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, about a massive marijuana plantation somewhere in northern Mexico. Acting on the tip, Mexican soldiers, under U.S. pressure, launched an operation in November that year. What they found shocked even the most seasoned investigators. El Filo was not a farm. It was an industrial complex hidden in the desert. Helicopters flew overhead as soldiers burned fields that stretched endlessly across the horizon. The loss was catastrophic. Thousands of tons of marijuana were destroyed, and the cartel lost millions overnight. Inside the organization, suspicion grew. Someone had betrayed them. Whispers of informants and leaks spread through the ranks. Among those who had been investigating the cartel's operations was a DEA agent named Enrique, Kiki, Camarena, working out of the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara. Camarena had been gathering intelligence for months, tracking shipments, tracing money, and building a case against the cartel's leaders. He had become a problem, one Gallardo's circle could no longer ignore. In early 1985, Camarena was abducted outside the U.S. consulate. He was forced into a car and taken to a house linked to Caro Quintero's men. Over several days, he was interrogated and tortured as cartel members demanded to know what he had discovered. When his body was found weeks later, wrapped in plastic and buried in a shallow grave, the discovery sent shockwaves across both nations. The murder of an American federal agent on Mexican soil provoked one of the largest investigations in DEA history. The United States demanded justice, and the pressure on Mexico became unbearable. Operation Leyenda was launched, an unprecedented manhunt targeting those responsible for Camarena's death. Within months, key figures of the Guadalajara cartel began to fall. Rafael Caro Quintero fled the country but was captured in Costa Rica in April 1985. Don Nito was arrested shortly after. The arrests sent the organization into chaos. For the first time, Gallardo's empire was in danger. As his partners disappeared, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo moved carefully. He avoided public appearances, changed locations frequently, and relied on his political connections to remain untouchable. Unlike his counterparts, he understood that survival depended on adaptation. The old model of a centralized cartel was finished. The government and the United States had learned its structure, its names, its weaknesses. To survive, Gallardo would need to build something new, something that could not be destroyed by the fall of one leader. Quietly, he began reorganizing what was left of the drug trade. He summoned the remaining regional bosses and proposed a new order. Instead of a single cartel controlling the entire country, each region would operate independently, managing its own routes, finances, and security. But they would remain united through cooperation, avoiding conflict, sharing intelligence, and maintaining steady prices. Each would pay a portion of their earnings for the use of established routes and protection. It was a federation, not a dictatorship. The system was designed to prevent internal wars and preserve stability, ensuring that profits flowed without interruption. Among the men who attended those secret meetings were the future architects of Mexico's modern cartel era. The Arellano Félix brothers of Tijuana, Amado Carrillo Fuentes in Juarez, and the Gulf Organization under Juan Garza Unbrigo. Each would go on to form their own empires, each tracing their origins back to the structure Gallardo had created. What began as an act of preservation would later become the foundation for decades of cartel warfare. By the late 1980s, Gallardo's influence extended across Mexico. His name was rarely spoken publicly, but his decisions shaped the direction of the country's drug trade. He lived modestly compared to his peers, often appearing calm, reserved, and almost bureaucratic in demeanor. He was called El Padrino, the Godfather, not for his brutality, but for his control. Behind the scenes, he continued managing finances, coordinating routes, and overseeing negotiations with Colombian suppliers. His organization remained disciplined, even as international scrutiny intensified. But power never stays hidden forever. The DEA's investigation into Camarena's murder continued to unravel connections that led back to Gallardo. Witnesses surfaced, bank records were traced, and political protection began to waver. The same network of influence that had once shielded him began to collapse under pressure. Rivals within the Federation grew restless, and the unity he had built started to fracture as new ambitions emerged. As the decade drew to a close, Gallardo's empire stood at a crossroads, still vast, still profitable, but increasingly fragile. The storm that had started with the death of one DEA agent was reaching its peak, and the man who once united Mexico's traffickers under one banner could feel the walls closing in.